Okay, so thank you, Kelly and Joel, for coming to talk to Leonie and I about our problem. Just before we start, we'd like to see if you have your permission to record this interview.
Yes, no problem. That's fine.
Okay.
Great. Okay, so we've just given you an overview of the research problem, and I suppose I'd like to start briefly with, if you wouldn't mind giving us an overview as to what the situation was before you made the changes to car parking around, and we'll just focus on the Hobart campus for
Sure.
sake of simplicity.
Okay. All right. Well, just if we go back to what was, I suppose, the university, and we'll talk about Sandy Bay campus, has a range of different parking options available for staff and students. They were permit parking for staff, voucher parking, so where you buy a voucher that will allow you to park for a certain length of time, and there was a proportion of free parking available as well. So in June last year,
mid-last year,
so mid-2013, Council approved a range of changes to the way that parking was dealt with at the university. Joel and my job was to operationalise those changes, and so I suppose the main change was there was a change in the mixture of the parking options available on campus. So there is now still staff parking, staff permit parking, there is still voucher parking, and there is a proportion of free student parking, but I suppose the large amount of free parking that was available to staff, students, whoever, has been removed. So we have a situation where we have staff permit parking, voucher parking that's available to staff and students, and there's a proportion of free student parking as well. They're probably the primary things.
And just the background there is, as well as it being free last year, it was totally unrestricted, so there was no capacity to measure whether it was staff or students or members of the public utilising the spaces that were available. In the year it was.
Okay, so why then was there a need to change? Can you tell me about the process of, we've got this three-tiered structure, and then you talk about the council approving the changes. What was the problem with the original?
Well, a large proportion of the change, I suppose, around parking was around the sustainable transport strategy that the university has. And that talks around, it's quite a lengthy document if anyone wants to read it, but it talks a lot about the university having sustainable transport options to get to and from the campus. So those things include bus services, improved bus services. So rather than people driving to campus, that there is a range of options to available to staff and students and members of the public to get to campus without necessarily having to bring a car. So those things included improved bus services, bike hubs, and you will have seen that there's been an investment in
the electronic bikes.
Bike hubs, end of bike facilities, so showers and those types of things to encourage people to use sustainable transport. So the sustainable transport strategy was a major driver of the parking changes. So in addition to changing the mix, I suppose, of the parking options available, there was also trying to provide additional options for staff and students to use sustainable transport strategies to get to the campus.
Excellent.
Anything else on that?
Yeah, I think that's very much the ultimate. Yeah.
Well, I know, I suppose, from a staff member's point of view, you said in the before the changes we bought permits, but we bought permits to hunt. Unless you're on campus by about 9 o'clock or 10 past 9.
No, not even 9 o'clock. It was 8:30. You had to be there basically by 8:30
to get a park.
So we called them hunting permits.
I've heard that.
It was true.
And that has not changed that hasn't changed. If you're a staff member and you buy a parking permit, that allows you to go and look for a spot, which may or may not be available at the time you particularly want it. So that in itself hasn't changed. There's not a one-to-one ratio for permits to spots. The other parts of the there is other parts of the changes though where we've implemented increased half-hour parking, because there was a fair bit of feedback around. Particularly where lectures are not necessarily held in the same place where academics are located. So with centrally managed spaces, academics might go anywhere across the campus to actually teach. So there was feedback around, I need to drop stuff off, or I need to do. So there's increased like half-hour parking, increased schools and business units can have designated spots for their faculty or their business, or their school, so that if they have visitors coming in, particularly where you might have the members of the public coming in and you're doing research with them, or health things or things like that. So those sorts of additional spots were created, I suppose, to be keeping up with the modern way that the university teaches and that sort of thing.
Okay, so part of the strategy was to increase the price that we paid for parking. What impact has that had?
In terms of take-up, you mean, or demand?
Yeah.
Look, with the increase in pricing, we haven't seen a major drop-off in the amount of parking permits that people are applying for.
Oh, that's interesting, because there's more vacant spaces.
Yeah. You can
Seriously.
get here at 10:30 and get a staff park.
Yeah.
And what we have seen is a change in the locations of spaces. So as well as the number of spaces and the types, there was, without trying to change things around too much to get people completely confused as to where they could park, there's been a bit of a change in the mix of where those spaces might be. Yep. Not so much at the main centre of campus, but down the bottom next to the ovals and further up on the hill. There's been looking at what types of spaces and where, based on broadly what type of users need them. So there's been student parking put in some, both the top and the bottom of campus. Looking at voucher parking, for example, where there's more a bit of a transient workforce, so to speak. So in the SLIMS project, there's a lot of visitors coming and going. So acknowledging that they're not probably going to have permits, but that there's a need to come and go, and students are coming and going from there too. There was some voucher parking, for example, put around in that area. So it has seen a bit of a change in the location mix as well as the numbers as well. And we've been seeing some anecdotal evidence, I suppose, of different utilisation of the patches of that. Parking types too.
Yeah.
Because
that's really interesting.
It is, because the parking down the gym was all mostly free parking before. Now it's a mixture of staff and student. And it's interesting, so there's a lot of more staff using the area, so whether they're doing that to go to the gym or they do that for their walk, I mean, that's off tangent a bit, but it's just interesting to see how people choose to incorporate that into their...
And I think we also need to take into account that where people are located is changing as well. With the waterfront, IMAS waterfront building, a whole pile of staff have moved into the city.
That's true. Yeah.
So traditionally you would have had all those staff parking maybe down the front. But again, with business moving off the hill,
there goes our parking.
you may well have an influx, more people parking down the bottom. But we think about that as well in terms of, as Joel was saying, where we have allocated parking. Sometimes you can go down to the bottom of the campus near Grey Street, and you will see vacancies. But we know that business is going to be coming down the hill, so don't touch it.
You're going to have to get there earlier again.
No, I'm going to be back down the bottom again.
And I mean, what you're discussing there is a really good example that things do change so constantly.
Yes.
A very small change, seemingly small change, can have a big impact in how people's day works. So they may choose to drive, and to some extent, the broader parking and the transport strategy is trying to encourage people to make use of those other forms, even intraday as well. So Kelly mentioned half an hour drop-off zones before. We had feedback as well that, for example, the spaces that were there before were being used by delivery drivers and that sort of thing. So we've also looked at how those spaces are used and maybe putting more loading zones, specific loading zones, service areas for service vehicles, whether that's university service staff or external contractors, because they may have been using the half an hour spots or the short-term spots, which might have prevented staff from moving around. So looking at that whole mix and acknowledging that the broader university changes the way they do things all the time, and people's movements are affected by that as well.
Okay, so I suppose to finish, your quick overview of whether you think the changes have achieved what you wanted to achieve.
I think the changes have, when we spoke before, Joel mentioned that we weren't quite sure who was using the spaces in some instances, particularly where there were big tranches of free spaces. We didn't know whether it was a university staff member, it could have been a member of the public parking there,
The bus stop right
a
outside.
stop right outside going into
that's a
town.
good point.
So from the perspective of UTAS, the staff and the students, we know that they're the users of our parking
Yes,
infrastructure.
We can control that.
Yeah.
We can
Yeah.
control,
Yeah.
So we can control that, and so from a student perspective, I think they know that there is parking that is for them, and they can look for a spot there. So I think that's been certainly one of the main. That's a good win. I don't think that we've seen. I think most of it has worked quite well. I don't, being able to change the mixes around and the half-hour spots and the drop-off zones and creating additional access spots for people with disability. I think all those things have made the mixture of the parking better for staff and students. So overall, I don't think I think it's been implemented and introduced and accepted as we've,
well, the objectives
progressively
have
moved
basically
through.
met, I think, of what we were tasked to do, and that's all. As I hope you've seen as well, that the people have become familiar with what's out there and what's available, and then made the most of it.
I mean, there's still things that we're in the middle of doing. So, like for example, carpooling, we're trialling that in Sandy Bay in the second half of this year. I don't know if the spots are actually in yet, but we've certainly put it out there that people can. There'll be specific carpooling spots. So again, that's part of the sustainable transport strategy. So we'll be introducing carpooling. And we're continuing to roll out end-of-trip facilities and looking at the bike hubs and how we can improve those and bike security and those sorts of things. So, I think Joel's right. I think the objectives have been met. But I think also it's an area where we need to maintain some vigilance around. Is it still okay?
Yeah. Yes, not just have a plan, settle
Yeah,
it, and that's it,
that's
walk
done.
away.
Walk
That's
away.
all.
Yeah.
What's the next job?
Because teaching is changing, the way students are accessing the campus are changing. So I think we just need to keep, as I said, be vigilant around and make sure that we don't just sort of let it go, and that it does keep up with the way university life changes.
Excellent.
Excellent.
Thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
Stop that now.